Hello, welcome back to the channel. On this channel, I like to talk very much about various negotiation themes. And of course, this week has been rather dramatic in that respect, in that the crisis over Ukraine has started to really brew up. Now, it's been going on for a while, but things are getting more dramatic and more intense. So I could hardly let that pass without comment, so I thought I would discuss that in this video. And whenever we look at things like these, I always encourage people to think about the analysis side of things. How are you going to analyze the situation, challenge your assumptions, and perhaps determine the strategy based upon that? So this is what I'm going to talk about in the first slide here. How are we going to analyze what is going on with Russia, with Ukraine, with everyone else, the West, whether it's the US or NATO or the EU? Now, the first thing I shall just highlight is some people like to use game theory. I do not use game theory myself. I enjoy reading about it, but the sort of negotiations I do, if I was to use game theory, apart from being mathematical, which is not my favourite thing, I would spend too much time having to put these data in to the model to try and get accurate results. So really, I tend to do a bit more of a verbal narrative equivalent to game theory. However, some people do like to use it, and actually it is quite interesting to use game theory to try and explain this scenario. So I'm going to post a link in the video description below to a video created by a different channel, TLDR, which I thought has done quite a nice video on this. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that. Another element or typical thing that you would do for negotiating or preparation for negotiation is SWOT analysis. And that's where you analyze the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's reasonable, and certainly in a political context, certainly when you're trying to deal with a wide variety of sometimes interlinked features. So that is one methodology that people can use. You could even use the methodology that I have been talking about on this channel, which is where you analyze adversarial versus collaborative styles of negotiation. So I don't think there's too much you can say here in the case of Russia over Ukraine. This is obviously going to be very adversarial. However, some of the things I talk about in terms of understanding compromises, red lines, and seeking objectives and understanding what information you have and do not have. These are the sort of things I'm talking about that could be applied here. Another one, which is also going to be very useful in political context, is stakeholder and behavioural analysis. This is where you really look at all the main parties that are involved in any particular negotiation, particularly when you have multi-party negotiations, and try and understand what is going on there. Why are people putting forward positions or acting in the way that they are? So those are the various tools I will highlight. They're not an exhaustive list. People can come up with other tools. The main thing I would always tell people when I'm teaching them to negotiate, it almost doesn't matter what tool you use. What matters is that you use a good one, and the one that will help you structure what it is you want to do. But possibly in this case, there's a credible argument to be made that none of these tools really apply. And this is all about geopolitics and competition. And that therefore we should look at this issue in that way. Or you could take the view you could try and use all these different analysis tools. There's nothing wrong with that if you have the time and the will to be that comprehensive. So let's get further into it. Let's try and do some of this tentative analysis. First question I'm going to ask, what does Russia want? And before I even ask that question, I'm going to ask a bit of a side question here, which is, do we actually mean Russia or do we mean President Putin? And the reason why I ask that question is normally, these two things would be distinct. The individual would be distinct from the state. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be any kind of expert on Russian politics and how it works, but what I do know about Russia, apart from the fact that Putin is the president and has an awful lot of power, is that for many years, possibly even decades, Putin has been very successful at eliminating opposition. And the whole variety of means that he has done that. He's used the tools of the state, he's used the legal system, he's even used very underhand methods. He's got rid of opponents, possibly directly, poisonings, whatever. He's shut down rival newspapers, outlets that would be critical to him. So we're in this position now where Russia is the country advocating argument, position, threats over Ukraine. But is it Russia as a whole, or is it Putin doing so and pulling the country along with him because he is the head, he is the figurehead, and he is the man in charge? And it's important to understand that because individual behavior is not necessarily the same as state behavior. And I always encourage anyone to understand that because individuals can be subject to emotion, possibly not Putin, he seems a bit unemotionless, but normally individuals can be subject to emotional pressure, whereas the state will respond differently to that sort of emotional pressure. So one of the positions that we know that Russia, Putin, have been pushing forward very hard is that they see NATO expansion as a threat, and see that as a direct threat to Russian interests. On the face of it, that would make a certain logical sense. After all, NATO was an alliance constructed specifically to challenge not Russia, but what was then the Soviet Union. So NATO was then a military threat. But is it now? And in fact, has NATO expansion been a threat to Russia? And I have to confess I find this not a particularly credible argument for two reasons. One, it doesn't take a great deal of intelligence to know that NATO doesn't really have any kind of desire to go and invade Russia and take over the country. That's not really what NATO is ever set up to do, and neither does any of the countries in NATO have any interest in doing that. So NATO is not going to be any kind of direct threat to Russia. Has NATO expansion been a threat to Russia? Possibly. It has challenged Russian control over near areas, other countries. But NATO expansion hasn't really been done in a way in recent years or recent decades that actually poses any particularly military threat to Russia. I believe a lot of NATO expansion has been in more the former Yugoslavia area, not even particularly on the Russian border. So why is Russia making such a noise about this? Well, there are a couple of arguments that can be made on that question. One is, it's just an excuse. This is the opportunity for Russia to try and reassert themselves as a world power. Because don't forget, Russia has been very much in decline in the last few decades due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic collapse, and so on that all resulted. And Putin, as the strongman, is quite nationalistic. He wants Russia to be at the top table. So there's an argument that can be made that the objective here is a bit of megalomania, really. They just want to be important again. They want to be back on there and they want to be making a noise and making people tremble at what it is they can do. That is one argument. And when we look at some of the behavior, particularly Putin in the last few years, there's some evidence to support that. But actually, personally, I think there's something else, and that is all about control. When I talk about negotiations, I do talk about being in control. You want to control all aspects of the negotiation. You want to control how you react to things, the people in your team, the positions, the pace of the negotiation, perhaps even the environment, the room, the serving of coffee, lunch, whatever. These are all things, as a negotiator, you want to control because it gives you an advantage. It helps you to put forward your position, to put forward arguments and so on. When you start to lose control, you start to be in a weaker position in terms of the negotiation. So let's apply that in terms of Russia. Russia wants to be able to negotiate. And to do that, they need to have a lot of control. Now let's compare them to the US, for example, or even China. In very different ways, the US and China are able to exert considerable control over their neighbours, and even far neighbours, shall we say, all around the world. They do so by diplomatic means, by economic means, by trade, even by military threats, if necessary. All those tools are available to them. But if you look at Russia, you think, well, how did Russia do that? And I think perhaps an argument to say that in the last few decades, Russia has all been about, or Putin in particular, about reasserting control, particularly in Eastern Europe. So we talk about Ukraine, and we're not talking much about the other countries at this point. I'm sure similar arguments can be applied. But what is it that makes Ukraine a threat to Russia? They're not a particularly big or powerful country. They certainly have no aspiration to invade Russia. They do, however, have aspiration to join NATO, or some of them do anyway, and also Ukraine does have an aspiration to become a fully functional democracy. I know some might argue they are democratic, some might say they've got a bit of a way to go, but that is the aspiration of Ukraine. And one of the things about being a democracy is that it is much harder for a neighbouring state to actually control that country. After all, if the country is ruled by a dictator, it is much easier to apply pressure on a single dictator, whether through favours or threats, where it's much harder to do that with a democracy. So there's a strong case to be made here that Putin just wants to control Ukraine. He doesn't particularly consider Ukraine a particular threat, doesn't particularly think that Ukraine joining NATO particularly matters in any meaningful sense, in a military sense, but it does matter in a political, especially a geopolitical sense. So really, the argument here is that Russia and Putin don't want Ukraine to have democratic control over their country. They wish to exert their control to influence what is happening in that country. And this idea goes back a long way. This goes back to the Second World War period, where Russia saw Eastern Europe as buffer states against the West. So maybe that is the mentality. Maybe that is the negotiation objective here, really, for Putin and Russia. It is to have control. So how are they going to be achieving that? Well, one option is military. And do we think that Russia particularly just wants to invade Ukraine? Not so sure about that. But I think there is a good argument to say that they want to negotiate their objectives. And the military build-up is there as a negotiation tool. I've talked about that in the past. So what Putin and Russia are doing is they're making threats that can be taken seriously. Threats to invade, to take over Crimea, to take over the Donbass region, whichever it may be. Ukraine and the other nations take those threats seriously because Russia is not necessarily in the habit of making threats that it doesn't carry out. So that is a means of negotiation. You make a threat and you have to be taken seriously to get people to respond to that threat. That is one negotiation strategy. Another aspect of what Russia has been doing is sowing a lot of confusion. And they do that by everything they do being in some ways deniable and ambiguous. You can't be quite too clear what it is Russian intentions actually are. Do they actually intend to send 100,000 people over the border? Will they take over the whole country? Will they take over part of the country? Will they just send special forces? Who knows? There's lots of options here. And that adds to the uncertainty of the people trying to challenge them. And that itself is a negotiation tactic. You introduce ambiguity to throw the other side off a little bit. And the Russians are quite good at that. They've been doing that for many years. A lot of their tooling and propaganda is very much geared towards doing that, towards undermining the other side in terms of how they think. There's been another aspect to the tactics employed by Putin and Russian diplomats, and that is they've written draft treaties, for example, and they've submitted to both NATO and to the US, which is a bit bizarre really, because you would have thought that those treaties should be submitted more to Ukraine, but that's part of the negotiation strategy. And those treaties contained what were very much unreasonable demands. And the Russians are not stupid. They know those demands are unreasonable. But they've made them anyway. They've made them to apply pressure. Perhaps it's part of the propaganda. But it's also part of the preconditioning, which is start high and hope that when you finish the negotiations, you get to around about the point that you're willing to agree to. So that is an obvious strategy. We shall see how the US and NATO responds to those sorts of conversations tend to happen behind closed doors. But the fact that it's been reported, those treaties, and the initial response shows that this very much is one of the Russian strategies. And the final one, I think, is more interesting, and one that I also want to talk about in negotiation terms. When it comes to reframing of principles, the thing to remember that when you are negotiating with someone, you need to understand whether the issue you are negotiating is a tradable or a red line. If it's a tradable, there's room for maneuver, there's room for compromise. If it is a red line, you need to find a solution to that red line. You cannot trade it. If that person or the organization has articulated a proper red line, they cannot move from that, or they cannot move below it anyway. But they can move perhaps around it. Now, if those red lines are based upon a principle, and a principle can be based on morality, for example, things that you think are morally correct to do. So, for example, it's a simple principle, it's wrong to break the law, it's wrong to murder or rob someone, Those are legal things, but they're also based on moral principles. And you will not get people to compromise on those principles unless A, they've already been compromised by one means, or unless you change the way they think about those principles. And it's the same in negotiation. It's the same in terms of how you brainwash people. You reshift their way from principles. And I'm not advocating brainwashing in negotiation, by the way. I'm talking about how to negotiate when someone has articulated a position that they feel strongly about because they consider it to be a matter of principle. So let's take this issue about Ukraine. If we believe that what Russia wants to do is stop Ukraine being able to make democratic principles, then as countries in the West, that is an issue of principle. That's against what we consider to be right, morally right. And so instantly there's going to be resistance to Russian demands as a consequence of that. So what Russia needs to do is reframe how people think about that principle. So for starters, not have people believe that this is about control of Ukraine, about undermining democracy, but rather perhaps that it represents threat to Russia, that it represents unacceptable breach of previous agreements or undue influence, whatever way they want to reframe it. And this links back to the point about deniability and ambiguity. They are trying to muddy the waters to make people doubt themselves and doubt the position that they hold when negotiating against Russia on this matter. So that's what reframing is. You try and shift people to think about the issue in a different way to how they started. And Russia put a lot of effort into that sort of thing in the last few years in many Western democracies. And they will be trying to do that over Ukraine, both for domestic and an international audience. So, what can NATO do about this? What's the role of NATO in all of this? Well, really, you have to remember that NATO is a defensive alliance. It is not a political, diplomatic, well, I say it's political, it's not a diplomatic or economic entity. So what that means is NATO is all about military, use of military force. It is not about applying sanctions. Not really even about negotiating political matters like control of another country. And as Ukraine is not a member of NATO, then strictly speaking, Ukraine did not come under this defensive umbrella. So this becomes a political issue, not a defensive alliance type issue. However, that doesn't mean NATO can't be influential, because the biggest strength about NATO is being unified, having a collective sense of purpose, and everyone within NATO being united and standing together. Because it doesn't matter how powerful any individual country is, no individual country, not even Russia, would want to go against, in a conventional warfare sense, against the collective might of NATO. That is the whole point. Everyone is there to protect each other, to look after one another. But what Russia is doing isn't a direct threat to NATO. It is a direct threat to Ukraine, but it's not a direct threat to NATO. So that strength is perhaps not quite there. But rather, and this is particularly what Russian tactics are trying to do, to exploit NATO's weakness. And NATO's weakness is that it has quite a large numbers of countries and organisations and so on involved. And they all require compromise or consensus to pull together in the same direction. And that is not easy if you are going at it from a little bit of a side angle, which Ukraine is. Because if Russia was making this exact same threat to Poland, for example, which Poland is a NATO member, and the NATO alliance would swing in defence of Poland, because that is already an agreed consensus position. Defending Ukraine is not an agreed consensus position, and Russia knows that, which is why Russia specifically is obviously targeting Ukraine and wouldn't do the same with some other countries. So this then represents a bit of a problem for NATO, in that they don't actually have much they can do. They can talk a lot, they can have lots of meetings, but really the only tool for NATO is the use of military force. So the biggest problem that NATO has is that it doesn't have consensus to essentially mass troops and armour and aircraft on the European side of the Ukrainian border, with the threat, a credible threat, that any Russian aggression into Ukraine would be countered by military force. That is the big tool that NATO should have and doesn't have. So that makes NATO not particularly useful in this particular crisis, in all honesty, unless that consensus to adopt that sort of position is reached. So let's talk about the EU then. What can the EU do? Well, the EU has many of the same strengths and weaknesses as NATO. But the reality is the EU has far more options, far more ability to influence the scenario than NATO does. This is because the EU is a political, diplomatic, economic union. And that can be disputed by some. But that is what the EU does. And by having that consensus on those issues, the EU is able to apply leverage. So they can credibly counter Russian threats. Not in the military sense, obviously, that's what NATO is there for, but in the diplomatic and economic sense. If the EU decide to put sanctions on Russia, those will hurt. But then here we come to the EU's weakness, because the EU is not perhaps willing to stand up. And this is difficult for the EU, because the EU prides itself on being a very principled type of organisation. They're there to stand up to defend democracy, and they will no doubt see what Russia is doing as a threat to Ukrainian democracy. So why would the EU not do the principled thing? Well, one argument is this whole reframing of principles. They're struggling to see the political cost of challenging Russia, necessarily justifying. The other is economic. Russia had made no secret that it's quite willing to turn off the gas taps, and this could have serious impact on the energy, inflation, and even the sort of social situation particularly in Germany. So here we have the EU's weak point. Ironically enough, it's one of its strongest member, Germany. Germany is now the EU's biggest weakness on this matter, which is a bit ironic, really, in some ways, because Germany, of course, is the EU's strongest economic powerhouse. But in this scenario, Russia has perhaps neutered Germany by that reliance on Russian gas. So this is an interesting bit of power play. It's interesting to look at these strengths and weaknesses of these organizations and to see what should have been traditional strengths are now turned into weaknesses. Very clever of the Russians, actually. Of course, we've got the other powerhouse. We have the US. And the US has a whole load of options. In fact, the US has more credible options, economic and military. So the US negotiation tactic has very much been to hold the line against Russia, to negotiate, but not really to compromise. However, I don't think anyone particularly making the case that the US wants to go to war over Ukraine. I think there's no particular secret. Just like everyone else in the West, there isn't really that appetite to start a military fight with Russia. Even the Russians feel need to do so as well, or the willingness to do so. So really, the US strategy has been very much to try and hold the line through negotiated means and through making credible counter threats. So really, what those counter threats come down to is to make the political, military and economic cost to Russia of invasion exceedingly high. So what I mean by that is that we should work on the assumption that if Russia wants to invade Ukraine, militarily speaking, there's little anyone can really do about it, apart from Ukraine, of course. But obviously for them, that could be quite the challenge. But for everyone else, it's all about deterring Russia with cost. So, the political cost, of course. No one would work with Russia on a whole variety of matters that normally would be in mutual interest. That's one political cost. Military cost. Well, they're not going to be massing troops on the European side of the border with Ukraine. But what is happening is various countries, and the US and the UK in particular, are doing this, is they're flooding the Ukraine military with advanced weaponry, such as anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and so on, training and so forth. So what that means is that if Russian troops do invade, they will suffer casualties. How high casualties? Who knows? But there will certainly be casualties. And whenever you start to have casualties, particularly in greater numbers, it becomes quite hard, even in Putin's Russia, to hide all of that, all the dead bodies having to be shipped back. So that could create a political cost for Putin if there are too many casualties as a result. But perhaps the most credible threat of all is economic. And the US has made this very clear that if Russia does invade Ukraine, it will suffer an economic cost. Now, talking about the EU and NATO, many of which are the same countries, I'm talking about the countries in those organisations. I've spoken about their weakness, their lack of unity, their lack of willingness to stand up. And this is the thing you have to remember when facing someone like Putin, that sometimes you have to make the determination that compromise is not a good thing. Will the US compromise with Russia over certain parts of Ukraine? I don't know. But it doesn't sound like Biden is feeling particularly compromising. And so when he gave his speech earlier this week, I thought there were some very interesting bits in it. So he divulged in his speech, which seemed odd on the face of it, that there was gradients of retaliation, of economic retaliation against Russia. If they did a small invasion, there'd be some economic sanctions. If they did a full invasion, there'd be full-on economic sanctions. And he also made it clear that within the EU and NATO, there wasn't a unified position on how those gradients would stand. Now, on the face of it, this seems an odd thing to do. It seems like Biden is giving away the negotiation position to Russia. In reality, I don't think he is. In reality, I think it's completely different. Firstly, I think the Russians know this anyway. There's not going to be any kind of secret to them. They have a decent intelligence service. It's perfectly capable of finding this thing out. So Biden would only be stating what everyone already knows. What I did take away from Biden's speech is that he was chastising those nations that were sitting on the fence or wavering and pointing out to them that in this scenario, compromise does not work. You have to make credible threats. And a proper credible threat is to make the economic cost to Russia too high, regardless of what it is they do, whether it's a small invasion, big invasion. You just make the cost too high. That is the strategy. That's the negotiation position of the US, and the US is applying pressure on NATO and EU members to match them in that position. So, final point here. What will it take to stop Russia from invading Ukraine? Well, there's only real two ways you can go on this. You either capitulate, and believe me, reaching an agreement with Russia where they can have what they want is the capitulation. There's some fundamental red lines there, the fundamental breach of principles to agree to Russian demands. And the Russians know that. So, and they are banking on that lack of appetite to challenge them, to push for the capitulation. This will strengthen Putin's power. It's make him seen as the stronger person, the stronger, the force, the statesman who's able to get his own way. So this is where I talk about the personal versus the state type influence, because capitulation possibly doesn't really benefit Russia at any state level, but it does benefit Putin on a personal power level. So the alternative to this is that they don't capitulate, but they're not going to be making military maneuvers, military reactions to Russia aggression. So the only strategy, the only game in town for the West really is the cost. And here's where things could get very interesting. And this is the calculation that Putin is going to have to make. If the US succeeds in building an economic alliance against Russia to bring those economic and political costs to bear, the EU needs to be on that. So let's say the EU and the US agree full sanctions on Russia, which will hurt quite a lot, possibly not fatally though. But let's imagine that the EU and the US also apply their diplomatic leverage elsewhere. So let's imagine, for example, they persuade China and India to join in on the sanction. I know this is unlikely, but let's imagine that they do. Then the cost starts to get a lot higher. And then imagine that they also get the Middle East to agree to align with the European and US positions. And at which point, if they can get all those power blocks to agree to apply economic cost to Russia, then this becomes a serious threat to Russia, to Putin and his power. Because even if he does invade Ukraine, the cost can be so cripplingly high that he will find his power base potentially significantly undermined within Russia. So this is really where countering someone who thinks that they can run roughshod over you, what matters is numbers. Having a collective response and the ability to apply unified action or aligned actions in a way that counters what the other side is trying to negotiate for. So we shall see. We shall see if the West is able to get agreement, consensus across the world to take those sorts of actions. But I think this is the calculation. This is what perhaps will stop Russia. If they realise that the tables are turning, there's a big wall of consensus building against them, then they will pull back. It will be the Russians that will have to capitulate. However, if there isn't that consensus, then it may be the West that will have to capitulate. So we shall see in the next few weeks. I hope you found this video interesting. It is a bit long, but then I try to talk for as long as required. I don't try to stick to a particular timeline, so apologies if you find that a little bit too long. But I hope you found this interesting, and I'll be interested to see people's comments in the comment box below.